Previously on British muzzleloaders. I might remind the viewer that this is in fact the final part of a 5-part series, and that if you haven't watched the previous 4 episodes covering this epic battle, then perhaps it might be advantageous to do so, as they better place this video, part 5, in the proper context.
Pennefather and the 2nd Division had withstood a hellish morning thus far. They had been reinforced by the Guards Brigade and the better part of Cathcart's 4th Division, the latter having been committed to battle in a somewhat piecemeal fashion.
The Guards and their reinforcements were still recovering from their participation in Cathcart's attack, and were making their way back to Home Ridge, completely shattered from their efforts. The Guards Brigade mustered only the equivalent of an understrength battalion. Pennefather had few men left at Home Ridge, a wing each of the 47th, 55th, and 57th, plus 2 companies of the Coldstream Guards, who had been on picket earlier in the morning and had not been committed to the initial fighting around the sandbag battery. There were also skirmishing parties of the 30th, the 20th, the 95th, and the Rifles. A wing of the 49th under Bellairs was still on Fort Ridge, and the French 7th Léger was formed near the 2nd Division camp, just behind the ridge. Approaching Home Ridge were further reinforcements. The 63rd Foot, complete, and the 21st Royal North British Fusiliers. A wing of the latter was sent immediately to relieve the 77th at the head of the Mikrikoff Glen. The 77th then began their return to Home Ridge. The stage was now set for another major effort on the Allied centre. It was between 8:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning when the Russian advance began. Some accounts describe as many as 12 battalions, 3 regiments taking part in the attack. Some are more ambiguous. The core of the attack were the 4 battalions of the Yakutsk Regiment. They formed the customary battalion columns, each of the 4 companies in line of 3 ranks, one behind the other. The battalions were formed in one great regimental column, forming a huge human sledgehammer. The remainder of the other troops, probably drawn from the Tomsk and Kovalansk regiments, found van and flank guards of considerable strength. They were probably formed in skirmish lines, supported by company columns. Here they are represented so, although their numbers historically were greater. Thus, this latest Russian effort was assembled in the shelter of the upper Kori ravine. Here, to the north of the barrier, they were out of sight of the British, and could gather in relative safety. The attack was aligned along the post road, which would serve as its axis up and onto the British positions at Home Ridge. It was a huge mass of men that emerged from the Kori ravine, crossed the barrier, and marched resolutely through the scrub and fog towards Home Ridge. To confront this sledgehammer, Pennefather deployed the detachments he had at hand. The 49th, stationed on Fort Ridge under Bellairs, was brought across to the centre. Also, the small parties of the 30th, 20th, 95th, and the Rifle Brigade were sent forward to skirmish with the Russians. He kept the wing of the 47th, the 55th, and a wing of the 57th on Home Ridge, along with the 2 companies of the Coldstream Guards. The skirmishing parties shook out through the scrub and were soon in action, doing their best against the substantial forces deployed on the Russian flanks. It must have seemed like an impossible task to have any effect on the relentless advance of the Russians. The scant British forces could do little but delay their adversaries. As was typical at Inkerman, confusion reigned supreme as the ground and the swirling fog and smoke cut units, companies, and even men off from each other. This resulted in large bodies of the enemy passing unnoticed, who were then free to make an approach to Home Ridge. A party of the Russian right flank found itself past the British skirmishers and was able to penetrate up to the west end of Home Ridge, where it found itself in front of a half battery of British artillery under Turner. Sergeant Major Henry of that battery was to later be awarded the Victoria Cross after defending the guns. He suffered 12 wounds in the process and was left for dead. For some reason, the Russians did not press their advantage and remained at the guns, content with their capture. While this was taking place, further Russian parties were able to reach the relatively undefended center of Home Ridge. The French 7th Léger had come up and had deployed into line, a somewhat unfamiliar formation to them. As the 7th completed their change of formation, they met the Russian vanguard at the crest of the ridge. Concurrently, the guns of Turner's battery off to the left were retaken by a stalwart yet strangely separated company of Zouaves, who emerged through the fog and fell upon the Russians still located there. Following them up, the 21st and the 63rd formed calmly in line and advanced obliquely through the battery and finished the job. They quickly became targets of the Russian artillery and halted to lay down and take cover for the time being. Back in the center, as the Russian numbers grew, the 7th began to falter. The 77th, under Egerton, had arrived from being relieved at the Mikirkov Glen, and immediately formed to the left of the 7th in support. Slightly left of center, the 55th had been surprised by the appearance of a considerable number of Russians at their doorstep, and had suffered some casualties and men taken prisoner, as they tumbled back down the reverse slope of Home Ridge. The Russians were to suffer some casualties from their own guns, firing from Shell Hill, as, at that range, both Russian and Britain looked similar. Despite this, things were looking fortuitous for the Russian attack, with the main body of the Yakutsk yet to arrive at Home Ridge. The bolstering of the 7th Léger by the 77th, and some haranguing by Pennefather, induced a degree of steadiness in the French, and they reformed in more familiar columns. The 55th, reformed, made a counterattack back to the crest, and this, combined with the reformed French with the 77th, was too much for the Russian vanguard. Shaken, they melted away. Success in driving off the Russian vanguard was fleeting, for the main body, consisting of the 4 battalions of the Yakutsk and the attending skirmishers, was near behind, advancing through the scrub, fog, and smoke for the main effort on Home Ridge. The 7th Léger, now in their more familiar double company columns, were joined by the wing of the 57th, who deployed off to their left, whilst the 77th wing fell into the rear in support. The whole advanced over the crest of Home Ridge and onto the forward slope to meet the Russian sledgehammer. Still out to the front and resisting the Russian attack were the remnants of Bellaire's 49th and the 20th under Vaughan. This thin screen in extended order could only do so much. With skirmishers to their front, the 7th Léger could not commence firing, and exhortations were delivered for them to get out of the way. This they did, and the French properly engaged the Russian column. During this, a party of the left flank guard broke away and found its way up to the breastwork on the right of Home Ridge. The climax of this latest attack was fast approaching, as the Yakutsk battalions, screened by flanking skirmishers, moved remorselessly towards the low wall atop Home Ridge. Met with French volleys, they pushed on. The Russian artillery continued to fire at this extreme range and incurred casualties upon their own men, as in the smoke and fog the masses of great-coated infantry could not be distinguished from each other. Despite the best efforts of the French, they appeared to waver as the Yakutsk came on. Pennefather immediately rode to the rear of the 7th and encouraged them to stand and fight. The recently returned 49th and 20th companies closed up to further bolster the morale of their allies. Thus the Russians lapped up against the 7th and the 57th on the left. As mentioned, a party of the Russian flank guard had been able to approach the right of Home Ridge, finding its way through a gap covered by brush, smoke, and fog. The guns there were firing high. Seeing this, Captain Yelverton dismounted and laid the gun himself. Grabbing the linstock, he fired the gun with its load of canister into the oncoming Russians. So stunned by this close-range delivery of fire, the Russians turned about and melted back into the smoke. The right had been saved. Now, this was not an isolated action, and represented but a fraction of the effort that came to pass all round about the same time. As Yelverton was directing his gun towards his front, the French were wavering in the center. Despite Pennefather's colourful encouragement and the support of the British troops nearby, the 7th was not doing well. The Yakutsk trudged up the shallow slope, and it appears historically that they were about to deploy the rear battalions out into some form of linear formation for their final assault to push up and over Home Ridge. It was at this very moment that an action was to occur that would be measured in its effect out of all proportion to the numbers involved. With the Yakutsk pressing at the French, Colonel Dobny of the 55th, who had recently reformed and ejected the Russian vanguard from their section of Home Ridge, spied through the fog and smoke the greater part of the 4 Russian battalions stacked up behind each other, coming up the post road.
There they are!
Seeing a chance to take the enemy in the flank, he stepped onto the parapet and called his men to follow him. One might imagine what the reaction may have been. Through the noise and confusion of the general action then taking place on Home Ridge, about 30 men, a tiny number, heard their colonel and clambered over the low wall. Without hesitation and seizing the moment, Dobny led his tiny party at the charge directly across the front of Home Ridge and plunged headlong into the leading companies of the Yakutsk 2nd Battalion. The Russians were taken completely by surprise as their attention was firmly fixed on their front, and the French barring their way to Home Ridge. Colonel Dobny, followed closely by his 30 men, careened headlong into the tightly packed ranks of the Yakutsk, and their effort blew through the Yakutsk like a cannonball. One of his men, Sergeant Walker, wielding his rifle like a club, displayed particular power and aggression. The Russians reeled. The following battalions were thrown into disarray by this sudden and overtly violent attack. Confusion spread, and men in the lead battalions began to look over their shoulders. The 3rd and 4th Yakutsk battalions in the rear were about to deploy to the left and to the right to broaden the attack. Seeing the 2nd Battalion thrown into disarray by Dobny and his 30 men, they faltered and began to retire. With French musketry to their front and an exceptionally savage attack appearing to their rear, the lead battalion too staggered and then broke, exhausted from their attack. The 55th men paused in the relative safety of the open ground at the other end of Home Ridge. They had achieved an effect that far outweighed their numbers. The Yakutsk and their accompanying flanking parties fell back off the rise of Home Ridge. Seeing this, imbued with renewed vigor, the 7th Leger, supported by the 57th and what remained of the 20th and 49th, went forward, spurring the Russians on back from whence they came.
With the main body of the Yakutsk attack against Home Ridge repulsed, this was clearly the moment for continued pressure on the Russians. Elements of the Russian flank guard had been to the front of Colonel Ainsley's 21st and Colonel Sweeney's 63rd as they lay in the scrub, sheltering from the Russian guns on Shell Hill.
Sensing the moment, the cry of "Fusiliers, prepare to charge!" carried across their corner of the battlefield. Forward went the 2 battalions, each in line with bayonets fixed. They plunged toward the Russians, who turned and fell back on the barrier. Their speed carried them forward of the French, and despite their obvious action-winning impetus, suffered grievously in their endeavors. While the 21st proved themselves resilient and steady in the confusing and costly pursuit, the 63rd seemed to have suffered more so. In addition to the casualties incurred by the Russian artillery as well as the Yakutsk rearguard, the 63rd was ground away in this, its first commitment to action of the battle. They had recently taken a large number of recruits from where they had been stationed before the war. They soldiered well into the maelstrom, but it would seem they lost cohesion in the scrub, and by the time the barrier was reached, They were a shell of what they had been just moments before. What remained fell in with their comrades of the 21st at the barrier. The advance of the 21st and the 63rd had very much been in concert, though not necessarily coordinated with the stand of the 7th Leger and 57th. How could it have been? With the conditions on the battlefield in those particular spots, any kind of communication, however minor, was exceedingly difficult. Nonetheless, the Russians had been squarely repulsed from the very heart of the Allied position. As the men of the 21st and 63rd reached the low wall, providing hardly any cover whatsoever, they paused and drove the rearguard of the Yakutsk further down the Kori ravine. Captain Haines of the 21st soon found himself in command, as Colonel Ainsley had been shot, bringing up supports to bolster the newly taken position. Haines and a mixed party pushed forward of the low wall and pressed the Yakutsk further down the Kori ravine. This was not the rout it could have been, and the Russians had reformed and regained some degree of cohesion. As Haines and his party moved down the slope, the Russians offered a fight. Wisely, Haines returned to the barrier and began to make preparations for the counterattack that was sure to come. Haines' judgment was to be well-founded. With the repulse of this major Russian effort on Home Ridge, the British centre was stable for the time being. This would not last long, and soon Haines and his men, a mixed bag of parties of Coldstream Guards, riflemen, the 63rd, and his own 21st, were to begin an epic defence of the barrier that would last till the end of the battle.
From about 9:15, there had been considerable activity on the right flank of Home Ridge, where it met Fore Ridge. Although a great many men had returned from the slopes of the Kitzbühel following the assault of Cathcart's men and the Guards, and they were reorganizing in the lee of the ridge, it was the arrival of another key reinforcement that would eventually turn the tide at Inkerman: the arrival of the 18-pounders.
In perhaps the only meaningful order given by Raglan during the entire day, he had summoned 2 18-pounder field guns from the artillery park when the battle had begun in earnest. Now the fruits of his actions began to tell. Outgunning, though not out of range of the Russian artillery on Shell Hill and East Jut, these 2 behemoths were dragged by an assortment of men and beast with extreme effort to a position on the eastern end of Home Ridge. There, with much effort, they were brought into action and began to range on the Russian gun line on Shell Hill by 9:30. The reforming Guards Brigade, with barely 600 men, were positioned nearby for local protection. With their first shots, the 18-pounders drew a storm of counter-battery fire, through which the gunners worked unflinchingly. Their efforts saw them begin to dominate the Russian artillery within half an hour of opening fire. The 18-pounders were joined shortly after by French 12-pounders, who added their fire to the counter-battery efforts. It seemed somewhat far-fetched that just 2 guns, facing close to 100, could have any effect, but these large guns, reaching across to Shell Hill with their round shot and shells, had a stunning impact upon their foe. In addition, the positions from which the 18-pounders came into action had been prepared and used on the 26th of October during the action of Little Inkerman. The ranging information gleaned on that day, as well as the significant protective measures put in place, both gave an advantage over the Russian guns deployed in the open on Shell Hill. Soon, some of the Russian gunners began to shift their guns in an effort to gain some sort of respite, and others actually called their drivers forward to move the guns off the hill. Though no one was predicting anything yet, the fight for artillery dominance of the battlefield was swinging in Pennefather's favor.
The recapture of the low wall of stones and debris running across the post road was of critical importance to the security of the Allied position. The barrier would soon become the very epicenter of the Battle of Inkerman for the rest of the day.
Shortly after its taking, Brigadier Goldie, commander of the 4th Division's 1st Brigade, had arrived and took overall command. He, however, busied himself with consolidation, and his attention was taken up with finding reinforcements and, perhaps most importantly, ammunition. Haines of the 21st remained in local control. Goldie would later be mortally wounded by a bullet fired by a Russian rifleman. The Lutish rifle, a variation of the British Brunswick, was indeed formidable. It's important to realize that the fight at the barrier was every bit as epic a fight as had been experienced at the Sandbag Battery earlier in the morning. Throughout the late morning and on into the afternoon, the polyglot group of defenders resisted attack after attack. It would seem that the action there drew men from all over the battlefield. Right from the earliest hours of the battle, small groups, isolated skirmishing detachments, and fragments of battalions had been sent all over the Inkerman Heights, from the Wellway to the Kitspur. Many of these had become lost, suffering terribly in their actions, and had been forced to remain out in the scrub as the action swirled around them, exhausted and out of ammunition. As the Russians withdrew down the Corey Ravine, the respite afforded some breathing space. Various officers began combing the ground, looking for anyone to help keep the Russians at bay. Whilst the men of the 21st and the 63rd had been amongst the first to reach the barrier, they were joined by the remnants of skirmishing parties from the Rifle Brigade, the 57th, the Coldstream Guards, and even one party identified as being from the 68th. How they managed to traverse the battlefield after their attack down the Kitspur and end up at the barrier we will never know. Perhaps simply an ultimate case of the fog of war. Over the next while, they were reinforced by a detachment of the 77th, who brought sorely needed ammunition. A company of the 49th arrived soon after. Perhaps most strangely, they had in fact come from the opposite side of the battlefield. The so-called hay picket, guarding the slopes to the east of the 2nd Division camp, had been under the command of Lieutenant Astley, who, true to his duty, had remained in his position overlooking the Chernaya. With what was an obvious and major battle developing around him, and with no threat from Gortchakov's forces below, he had abandoned his position and had moved to the sound of the guns, finally arriving at the barrier after looking everywhere for a battle to join. Another point to note was that a great many men at the barrier were 4th Division men. The 21st, 57th, 63rd, 68th, and 20th, in whatever numbers present, were all armed with the smoothbore P-42 musket. These proved reliable and effective enough in fighting from behind the low earthwork against an enemy that was, by the very nature of the ground and conditions, very close. Time and time again, the Yakutsk came on to be met by the carefully husbanded volleys of the defenders and short, sharp, limited charges which sent them back, defeated and shaken but never routed, down to the shelter of the Corey Ravine. Gradually, as men came in, either in formed groups or as stragglers looking for leadership or action, the proportion of rifles held by the defenders increased. Many of those with P-51s were used to extend the defense to the west towards the forces stationed at the Mikryakov Glen. Haines placed these men in a position where they could not only flank the Russian columns coming up from the Corey Ravine, but also in one of the earliest uses of the full capacity held by the Minié rifle. Those on the left were directed to engage the Russian artillery when possible. Yet again, the Minié rifle proved itself worthy, and although this was still early days, the paradigm of infantry warfare was beginning to change. Engaging the Russian artillery on Shell Hill some 800 yards distant would have been, just months earlier, a complete and utter fallacy. Now, stood in the scrub oak on the lower slopes of Shell Hill, British infantry firepower was signaling the beginning of a new age. Although the power of long-range rifle fire was to great effect, the reply from the angered Russian batteries was significant. Moving to continually organize the defense, Haines recalled, "This small reinforcement had the best effect, for it showed we were in communication with our own people and not cut off as the men were beginning to imagine." Brigadier General Goldie joined us here. I explained to him how we were posted, that I should like to visit the party on the left, and that I would report to him in 10 minutes. I found the party all snug, but no firing from it. It appeared that they had been so plied with grape in reply that the officer in charge had ordered the firing to cease. In this he was right, for the position was exposed and valuable merely as a lookout. On my return to the barrier, I found Brigadier General Goldie mortally wounded. Lieutenant Vaughan of the 20th recalls. From behind the breastwork, we poured into the enemy showers of musket and minier balls, for besides our own men, we had some of the rifles and other corps, and even some of the guards. The Russians advanced to our work. We then rushed out with a cheer and charged the Russians, who then turned tail and fled double quick. We had again to retire, and this time poor Hurt was struck, and I was so done up I could not retire and fell struck down by a splinter of stone. A sergeant took my arm, and I was brought up and only escaped being made prisoner by a few yards. I laid down under the breastwork, and when the Russians came up to within 20 yards of the place where I was lying, I gave the 5 barrels of my revolver with great gusto.
At near the same time of the morning that the Yakutsk were first attacking and then withdrawing from Home Ridge, the French 6th Regiment of the Line was attacked by a Russian force that emerged from the Quarry Ravine and crested its eastern approaches.
The French 6th Line Regiment, who had earlier saved the day behind the sandbag battery, and who were positioned at the top of St. Clement's Ravine, were attacked by what was probably a mixed force of Russians that had taken shelter in the Quarry Ravine after fighting earlier in the morning. This would draw French efforts to eventually involve the better part of their entire commitment to battle. Pressed back by the Russians, the 6th were reinforced by the 7th Léger, fresh from their repulse of the Yakutsk. Despite both battalions now holding the spur, the French commander, Bourbaki, sent for further assistance. General Bosquet was on his way with a sizable body of infantry and cavalry, numbering some 4,600 men, including the reformed remnants of Cardigan's Light Brigade, now some 200 strong, who brought up the rear. The first French reinforcements to arrive were the chasseurs à pied, who had been sent ahead of the main French body at the double. Following were the tirailleurs algériens, 2 battalions of the 3rd Zouave, and the 2 battalions of the 50th Line Regiment. The chasseurs joined the remnants of the 20th Foot, who had been skirmishing indecisively in the area, and saw off the Russian advance from the Quarry Ravine. Despite the advance of these reinforcements, both the 6th Line and 7th Light withdrew all the way back to Home Ridge, where they would remain for some time. There then came an episode of the battle that on the surface might defy reason, but given the incredibly confusing nature of the ground, the environment, and scant, if any, knowledge of enemy locations, one might be able to understand. Pushing on into this relatively empty part of the battlefield, Bosquet directed his battalions to deploy out onto what would only later become apparent to him as being the Inkerman Tusk. This was a moment of apparent local victory. The French battalions advanced with drums beating and bugles sounding. Taking position on the high ground and orienting northwards, the Algerians and the Zouaves formed in sequence from the right, with the chasseurs taking position on the left and the 50th Line in reserve. The effect of such a substantial number of reinforcements would seemingly be of great importance, but in actuality it was a thunderous punch that swung in the air and did not connect. As the French battalions under overall command of Bosquet settled into their positions, the utter fragility and impotency of their position materialized. While Bosquet understood that he had reinforced the right and now commanded that part of the battlefield, he had actually placed nearly all of his men on ground from which they could not defend or indeed advance from. For the Inkerman Tusk was a dominating ridgeline that was impassable on either side and indeed ended on its eastern extremity with a massive cliff. The only way off or onto the Tusk was via its western approaches. Not long after Bosquet's men marched triumphantly on to the Inkerman Tusk, and with the battle for the barrier still raging, Russian forces would commit to action, seemingly quite by chance, and this would precipitate a near complete collapse of the Allied right. It must be said that apparently Bosquet believed his left to be covered by the British, and while they were certainly at the barrier, there existed a gap of considerable size between them. It was into this gap that the elements of what was perhaps the Yakutsk, or possibly one of the other regiments involved in the attack on Home Ridge, advanced out of the Quarry Ravine. Quite by chance, it would seem, the Selenginsk regiment, who had beat a retreat down St. Clement's Ravine earlier in the morning, made to advance up the ravine and on to the Kitzbühel. As they neared the upper reaches, they soon discovered a considerable number of French troops with their backs to them, up on higher ground to their right. This predicament was discovered in the nick of time, and with the only escape route off the cul-de-sac that was the Inkerman tusk threatened by converging Russian columns, Bosquet hastened to withdraw his battalions that were suffering at the hands of the Russian batteries facing them from across the Quarry Ravine on East Jut. While it did not degenerate into a rout, the haste with which the French vacated their positions lent towards, if not manifested itself, in panic. The French battalions, with order suffering, made their way back to Four Ridge, with only their guns, which had accompanied them into the attack, preventing a complete and comprehensive Russian follow-up. This had been a serious reverse, and Bosquet's men, and indeed his whole command, were gripped with a certain degree of despondency, and for the time being were in no state to act aggressively. The Selenginsk triumphantly gained the Kitzbühel, and once again, the sandbag battery, which had seen no occupier for some time, was in Russian hands. For the time being, the action raged at the barrier, but the only activity on the right remained the two 18-pounders' continued dominance over the Russian batteries on Shell Hill. After a period of time, the sullen state of the French was raised, which saw Bosquet contemplate some form of redemption. Strangely, the Selenginsk had not pressed their advantage after seizing the Kitzbühel and the sandbag battery, and it would thus seem that the time was right for something decisive. Bosquet committed 2 battalions initially, the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Zouaves and the Algerians. Together they advanced with the Zouaves on the left and the Algerians on the right. Attacking with great energy and noise, they fell upon the Selenginsk and the sandbag battery, and as they did so, out of the scrub appeared a small detachment of the Coldstream Guards, who had been sheltering and were isolated after their action in that same place. Seeing their relief in the friendly forces approaching, they joined with the Zouaves, and together they swept towards the sandbag battery. The results of this admittedly limited attack had the hoped-for decisive result. The Zouaves and Algerians, with their tag-along Coldstream detachment, crashed into the sandbag battery and swept the Selenginsk right off the Kitzbühel. It didn't end there. Repeating the result of Cathcart's attack earlier in the morning, the Russians tumbled down the slope, followed closely by the French. Unbeknownst to all, the wing of the 95th, who had reinforced the guards at the sandbag battery, and who had attacked down the Kitzbühel with them, had become cut off in the scrub, and were, at that very moment, about to embark on a very desperate plan to break out and fight their way back to the crest. Interrupted in their final preparation by a crush of Russians withdrawing all around them, and the arrival of the pursuing French, the 95th men, after holding their ground all morning, at last were able to return to less threatening circumstances. Although the immediate result of the French attack was similar to that of Cathcart's, the Selenginsk had lost all stomach for further action. They didn't stop at the bottom of St. Clement's Ravine, as they had earlier, but rather continued their retreat back and clear over the Chernaya. Reformed back on high ground, the French consolidated. Despite this apparent decisive action, there emerged a period of stalemate across the field of Inkerman.
By midday, the threat on the right had been eliminated, and the desperate action at the barrier was showing preliminary signs of waning.
It was noted that the repeated and furious attacks out of the Quarry Ravine were diminishing in energy. Playing a large part on the Allied side was the fact that the 18-pounders had run out of ammunition. The 100 rounds per gun that had been brought up initially had nearly been depleted, with the resultant slackening of their fire. So, with the French remaining firmly on the Kitzbühel, the successful defense of the barrier continuing, though leaving no allowance for large-scale offensive action, and the 18-pounders' dominance somewhat decreased, one can see that conditions were ripe for some form of stasis. More ammunition was sent for, and a frantic operation to bring it to the guns was undertaken. It took some time, but thankfully for the Allies, the Russians were exhausted, and nothing had gone their way. Despite large reserves not yet committed, it is clear that the rebuff they encountered at every turn was beginning to have a psychological effect upon Dannenberg. With both sides unwilling or unable to commit to any major effort, it took the replenishment of the 18-pounder ammunition to kickstart the final phase of the battle.
The 18-pounders recommenced firing near 1 o'clock, and quickly they asserted their dominance over the Russian artillery once again.
With the heavy round shot smashing into gun carriages and wagons, not to mention causing extreme discomfort to the Russian gunners, an opportunity arose. At the barrier, Haines had already sought to engage the Russian gun line with the rifles he had at hand. This had been met with limited, but not battle-winning success. Now, with the thunderous fire of the 18-pounders returning, he saw his chance. Summoning Lieutenant Acton of the 77th, Lord West, who had come over from the Mikirkov Glen, ordered him to take his 50 or 60 men, link up with 2 companies nearby, and, quote, advance against the battery. Now Haines had gradually been focusing more attention on the Russian guns as his situation would permit, but now, with West's orders, actual offensive action was to begin. Acton made his way with his men to the designated point and found the 2 companies mentioned to him. He gave a quick brief and made to advance. There seems to have been some consternation amongst the officers present, and after some disagreement, Acton simply quipped, "If you won't join me, I'll obey my orders and attack with the 77th." He turned on his heel and went to his men. He ordered an advance and began moving through the scrub. Not a man followed, for they had heard the disagreement amongst the officers, and were seemingly hesitant to comply with what could have been seen at that moment as somewhat suicidal orders. It took about 40 yards of Acton alone, moving towards Shell Hill, before anyone made a move. Then, suddenly, Private Tyrrell, one of his men, broke ranks and ran to catch up. The 2 were joined by a third, but still they were alone. Then, in one of those intangible, tide-turning moments, Acton's example and that of his 2 companions was too much for the remainder of his 77th men. They rushed forward to join him, advancing up the slope towards the battery. As they neared it, Acton split his men into 3 sections, his in the center and one on either side, with the intention of turning the battery's flanks. The men sprang into action, and with the round shot from the 18-pounders rushing overhead, pressed their attack. This seems to have been a somewhat isolated battery, and as they approached, the Russians had enough. Between the crushing fire of British heavy cannons, and now infantry advancing to their position, it was time to go. The battery commander brought his teams forward, limbered up, and drove away, leaving but a wagon and some kit left behind. Acton was joined as he approached the battery position by the 2 companies he left behind, who, in similar fashion, had succumbed to the example presented to them and advanced. On the surface, this seems like an unlikely event to have any great success, but this tiny action, involving just a handful of men, began a chain reaction that saw the end of Russian efforts at Inkerman. First one battery, then another, called their drivers forward to bring them out of action. Sensing that there was no more hope in achieving the aim, Dannenberg ordered forward the Vladimir Regiment to cover the remaining batteries off Shell Hill. The fact that this small group of men, drawn from multiple regiments on very short notice, and with daunting opposition, was now standing on Shell Hill, threatening the gun line, was the straw that broke the back of the Russians. Once the batteries had withdrawn, the remainder of the Russian army all over the field were ordered to retire. The withdrawal would take some time to coordinate and to complete. In the end, it would be well after nightfall before the withdrawal was done. Sheer exhaustion prevented any Allied follow-up. The Yakutsk, exhausted in the Kori ravine, turned about and headed for the Chernaya, as did the Okhotsk. The Vladimir regiment, having come forward, now withdrew, as did the remainder of the Russian reserve. Gradually, the noise of battle subsided as the last Russian regiments turned about and marched off Shell Hill. They headed down the Sapper Road back to Sevastopol. By 2 o'clock, silence had taken hold. The Russian withdrawal would not be complete until 8 o'clock that evening, but for the time being, the Battle of Inkerman was over.
The battle, which had opened some 9 hours previous, had seen Herculean efforts on both sides. While there had been great bravery and courage exhibited by all, it had been far from a one-sided affair. Hours of success, reverse, and impossible confusion had turned the battlefield into a seething mass of friend and foe, lost in the fog, smoke, and ruin of the Inkerman heights. Now, as daylight waned, the last of the Russian forces disappeared into the gloom, leaving in their wake a horrific sea of torn and dying men.
Men lay in heaps. Impossibly tangled masses of dead and wounded were everywhere, especially where action had been hottest. The ongoing suffering would continue for days as men were found and carried many miles back to camp, and perhaps many more down the steep and painfully rough track to Balaclava, en route to Scutari. The Russian casualties, too, faced a painful and uncertain future. Days and weeks would pass before an accurate assessment of the cost of the battle could be made. As action waned on the Inkerman Heights, the process of collecting the dead and the wounded began in earnest. Arrangements were pitifully inadequate. Regimental surgeons with a small staff were at work for most of the day, and they would continue to be so until long after the battle was over. In most cases, the regimental band acting as stretcher bearers were the only men dedicated to help the wounded. As they became available, parties of men still able augmented efforts. The British had committed just over 10,000 men, including those on Victoria Ridge, the Light Brigade, and a large proportion, nearly 10%, were gunners of the Royal Artillery. 2,573 casualties were suffered, dead, wounded, and missing. This amounted to some 25% of troops committed to action, a staggering amount. Hardest hit were the 3 battalions of the Guards Brigade, with an average of around 43% of their committed strength. Most battalions, such as the 95th, the 41st, and the 49th, suffered just over a 30% casualty rate. 635 men were killed outright, with more dying of wounds later on. For the French efforts, they suffered 929 casualties, with 175 dead. Russian numbers are somewhat difficult to ascertain, but the number of 12,000 exists, including some 3,200 killed. The Inkerman Heights were eventually cleared of wounded, and the dead were buried. But, as dire a struggle as it had been, the siege of Sevastopol would continue. On the 14th of November, as the Army of the East continued to lick its wounds, a hurricane-force storm blew in from across the Black Sea. The wounded, lying in tents or other makeshift shelters, were like their more healthy comrades subjected to even more unpleasant conditions, as tents, stores, and other facilities were completely destroyed. Upwards of 70 ships were damaged or wrecked. This was to have grave consequences for the coming winter, as precious stores and equipment were lost. The battle had interrupted plans to bombard the city for a second time, and with the onset of winter, that would have to wait. What followed was perhaps the most infamous winter in British military history. The army, woefully unprepared in both equipment and logistical infrastructure, nearly collapsed from privation, as the supplies landed at Balaclava could not, in the extreme conditions, be brought up to the divisional camps. Rotten tents, rotten food, and rampant disease and exposure were the hallmarks of that terrible period. The men who had fought and lived through the Battle of Inkerman faced their fate with stoic acceptance. A great many survivors of the battle did not survive till spring. With so much of the winter kit and supplies lost during the storm of 14 November, extreme privation set in very quickly. The men's greatcoats afforded moderate protection at best, and when the snows came, the men had to resort to all manner of frantic improvisation to stay alive, let alone comfortable. Sandbags, scraps of blanket, and anything that could provide some succor from the cold was utilized. Men literally froze to death. Some supplies did get through to those who needed them, and hastily made winter clothes were eventually acquired, often too little, too late. Furs, animal skins, and other garments were sent out as they could, and public subscriptions were taken up to provide for sorely needed mittens and caps. Most were left to suffer in what they had. The horrors of the Crimean winter wrote a shameful chapter in British military history that often eclipsed the courage and valor displayed on the battlefield. The siege began again in earnest in April of 1855 with the second bombardment. Also that year, the French began taking over part of the British siege lines. This included both the Inkerman Heights and Victoria Ridge, overlooking the Malakoff, while the British lines shrunk to a sector facing the Redan. Trenches, mud, and artillery embrasures and emplacements crisscrossed the Hersonese Plateau, with many scenes casting an eye to the future and other even more destructive wars. The siege was characterized, between bombardments, by small-scale attacks and sharpshooting from saps and rifle pits at gun emplacements and batteries. What would later be called sniping found in the siege of Sevastopol a very meaningful and effective role. Countless hours were spent on sentry and picket, and from time to time, action would be joined in no man's land. These engagements rarely developed into full-blown assaults as had been experienced at Inkerman. However, they could be nevertheless extremely significant for those involved. Their exploits never recognized, the men bore their duty with typical stoic attention.
What? They're right there. Wake up. Where are they? Oh. There's more coming. Back to the south.
The Russians would try once more to bring their field army to bear and lift the siege. The Battle of the Chernaya, fought on the 16th of August, didn't involve British forces in any meaningful way, and the Russians were soundly defeated by the French, aided by the Sardinians. The siege would continue until the joint attack on the Malakoff and Redan on the 8th of September 1855. While British efforts were ultimately unsuccessful at the Redan, the French were able to secure the Malakoff and thereby make continued resistance untenable for the Russians. They abandoned the city the next day and would ultimately lose the war because of it. The wounded and sick, if they didn't perish in the horrible conditions found in the siege lines, were ultimately evacuated to Scutari and on to the United Kingdom. The efforts of Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale figure prominently during the war, and no doubt men who had been wounded at Inkerman or after during the siege passed through their care, with Mary Seacole arriving later after the battle in early 1855. Wounded men in the mid-Victorian era were condemned to a life of hardship and, generally speaking, misery. A great many suffered on until their untimely death. While the efforts of the likes of Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale are well known, perhaps too was the interest held by Her Majesty the Queen in regards to her wounded veterans. Beginning in February of 1855, and sparked by news of the horrific conditions faced during the winter in faraway Crimea, she famously hosted wounded men at Buckingham Palace. These series of events were followed by visits paid to the military hospitals themselves. Both she and Elbert became attentive to the conditions and welfare of the men therein. Rejoining their regiments, or discharged from the army, veterans of the battle would have been deservedly proud of what they accomplished on that day in November 1854. The Crimean War left a lasting legacy that endures to this day. While an exhaustive study is not the preserve of this video, There are some points to consider with regards to Inkerman in particular. The Crimean War was one of the first to be photographed. Roger Fenton famously brought his equipment and was prolific in his work. He arrived in 1855, so was not present at Inkerman, but did capture some of the landscape of the Inkerman Heights and photographed many of the personalities, mostly senior ranks, who played a role at the battle. Being fought in November, Inkerman featured the men dressed in their greatcoats. With few exceptions, these woolen overcoats were the only protection against the elements. Now, the Crimean War has been long associated with a change in army dress, as during and after it, the transition was made from the coatee, with its embellishments of wings, lace, and epaulets, to the plainer and more straightforward tunic with its full skirts. This is erroneous. The army had already launched down the path of uniform reform before the war. Long overdue, the new garments were first seen in the Crimea in the year of issue, 1855, and for the rest of the war would gradually become more numerous. The double-breasted tunic would be issued to the infantry, the rifles, the cavalry, and the artillery, while the Highland regiments received their own version to replace the coatee, the doublet, featuring so-called Inverness skirts, which would feature first on Highland uniform and much later on all Scottish full-dress garments. Here we can see men of the Rifle Brigade dressed in their traditional green coatees, and later, in the post-war era, wearing the tunic. Another aspect of the battle that shed light on what was to come was the concept of sharpshooting and the full realization of what it meant to have the rifle as the infantry's primary arm. When the Army of the East set sail, it did so armed for the most part with the P-51 Minié rifle. This brand new arm and its revolutionary ammunition equipped 4 out of 5 divisions, there simply not being enough to go around. Previously, the Army had used rifles only in a specialist role. Indeed, the whole raison d'etre for the Rifle Brigade and the King's Royal Rifle Corps. Armed with the Brunswick rifle from the very late 1830s, the 2 battalions of the Rifle Brigade that were part of the Light and 4th Division respectively, as an extra battalion, were hurriedly re-equipped with the P-51, much like the remainder of the battalions in other divisions. In the case of the 4th Division, the 1st Battalion Rifle Brigade were the only rifle-armed men in that division. The Minié rifle was used in all the battles of the war, though arguably its capabilities both in long range and close range only became apparent once the siege began. Featuring prominently in the first parts of this series, Captain Goodlake's sharpshooters played a large part at Little Inkerman and were amongst the first men to engage the Russians on the 5th of November. The efforts of them, and others like them, in shooting at Russian gunners in Sevastopol set the standard for such work for the remainder of the siege. Numerous times throughout Inkerman, the Minié rifle proved a battle-winning weapon. From its close-range, hugely destructive volleys, with bullets passing through multiple men, closely ordered in the Russian columns, to the long-range fire that was used to engage the Russian artillery from Victoria Ridge and on Shell Hill by Haynes's men. The fact that infantry were possessed of a weapon with such characteristics proved time and time again that this was the way of the future. No wonder correspondent William Russell described its effect in one of his dispatches. "The Minié is the king of weapons. Inkerman proved it. The regiments of the 4th Division and the Marines, armed with the old and much belauded Brown Bess, could do nothing against the Muscovite infantry. But the volleys of the Minié cleft them like the hand of the destroying angel, and they fell like leaves in autumn before them." Of course, the P-51 and its ammunition were not the acme of invention, but rather the first step in the exponential leap in effect that the infantry would acquire. By the spring of 1855, issues of a new weapon, similar in design yet smaller in caliber, would herald the first truly universal service rifle, the P-53 Enfield rifle musket. When the project began some time ago, I did not have access to a P-51 with which to film the shooting sequences. An exceedingly rare arm, imagine my surprise and awe when friend of the channel, Brett, brought one along to the shoot in Alberta that I attend annually. Believe it or not, he let me fire it, in one of my most treasured historical shooting moments. I thought at that time this would be the only opportunity I would ever get to handle the destroying angel. I suppose that lengthy projects do have some benefits, for 3 years later, thanks to friends in the community, I was able to acquire an example of the P-50 run for the channel. It was with this fantastic piece of history that I filmed the shooting sequences for part 5 of this series. Don't worry, there will be a video on the P-51 in all its glory. Using both the P-51 and its replacement, the P-53, for this series has given a unique insight for myself as to the use and functioning of such arms in field conditions as it pertains to usage, reliability, and accuracy. Their calibers are different, but their ammunition functions similarly, and both are an absolute joy to shoot. This footage was shot in Alberta with Brett's P-51 and demonstrates loading and firing in the standing position, as would commonly have been used in close order, and the kneeling position, as would have been common in extended order when the circumstances of terrain and conditions allowed. The Battle of Inkerman became hugely significant in the culture of the regiments present. Known as the Soldiers' Battle, it was deservedly looked upon as exemplifying the very best qualities of the British soldier: dogged defense, unbridled aggression in attack, straight shooting, and the decisive ability to close with the enemy, all at one point or another were used to effect the final outcome. Although the names of all but a few of these regiments have ceased to exist, the tradition of Inkerman lives on even today. What follows here is a brief and non-exhaustive series of examples from, for the most part, the modern British Army. When the 3rd Battalion of the Grenadier Guards was placed in suspended animation in 1960, the Queen directed that the left flank or junior company of the 2nd Battalion would be formed by men ex of the 3rd Battalion and be named the Inkerman Company, to keep alive the memory of those 3rd Battalion men who fought so valiantly at the Sandbag Battery. So it was until 1994, when again the spectre of army downsizing reared its ugly head. The name of the company was transferred to the 1st Battalion's Left Flank Company, when the 2nd Battalion was, as well, placed in suspended animation. Today, Inkerman Company continues to be part of the 1st Battalion of the Grenadier Guards, and has seen service all over the globe. For the 41st Foot, so involved in the battle, the officers commissioned a silver centerpiece featuring a scene from the battle, which would later, after amalgamation, belong in the officers' mess of the 1st Battalion, the Welsh Regiment. The 68th Light Infantry, who had attacked so brilliantly down the slope during Cathcart's attack, and had been the only battalion to wear red during the entire battle, perpetuated the tradition of the Inkerman chain, a light infantry distinction as worn by the sergeants in that regiment. Through too many amalgamations, first into the Durham Light Infantry in 1881, and then the Light Infantry in 1968, today the tradition of the Inkerman chain is perpetuated by the Rifles, into which the Light Infantry were amalgamated in 2007. The Royal Artillery continue to name their batteries for the various battles in which they take part. 49 Inkerman Battery is part of 16th Field Regiment Royal Artillery and currently is an air defense unit. The 4th Battalion of the Duke of Lancaster's Regiment is a reserve battalion and have a company named after the battle. Of the antecedent regiments that have preceded it, fully 4 were at Inkerman: the 30th, 47th, 55th, and 63rd. A 5th, the 4th Foot, was in the 3rd Division and present during the Crimean War, but did not fight at Inkerman. Another interesting touchstone with the battle is perpetuated by the modern-day Mercian Regiment, whose drums carry a likeness of the sawtooth decorations found on Russian drums captured by the 95th Foot at Inkerman. Perhaps the most well-known insight into the men of the Crimea is the series of photographs known as the Crimean Heroes. Taken at Her Majesty's bequest in 1856, once the war was over, they feature various men from across the Army of the East, for the most part clothed in their new 1855 tunics and doublets, though with weapons and kit. They all feature their newly awarded Crimean medal, some, most assuredly, holding the Inkerman clasp. Modern Sevastopol has encroached to a degree upon the field of Inkerman, but there are still many places where one may get a good sense of the ground and its environs. Obviously, at the time of the publication of this video, the Ukrainian-Russian conflict is ongoing, and the Russian involvement in the Crimea has placed the field of Inkerman into a position whereby it cannot be visited by run-of-the-mill tourists. Friend of the channel, Patrick Mercer, has indeed visited the site many times, and much of it exists as it did in 1854, rolling hills covered in scrub oak. Perhaps one day, after the current unpleasantness has abated, we can seek to explore its complexity once again. The Crimean War holds a special place in the hearts of historical enthusiasts. It was the last war fought by the British in full dress. Although Inkerman was fought in the dull grey of the greatcoat, the army as a whole still turned out to fight in their red, green, or blue. The tactics and actions fought still had the Napoleonic aspect of the tested evolutions of line and column. But Inkerman in particular saw extensive and prolific use of extended order or light infantry tactics. As such, it stands as a wonderful backdrop with which to conduct war games, be they tabletop or board. The battle and war in general have been kept alive through reenactments and living history. Large recreations were conducted during the run of Aldershot tattoos in the 1920s and 30s, featuring reenactments of the fights at the Sandbag Battery and even the famous Lady Butler painting, The Roll Call. In more modern times, the Crimean War is kept in the memory by a number of groups, including the Rifle Brigade Reenactment Group and, of course, the Die Hard Company. Many more seek to remember and illustrate the history on a more personal and individual level. Those in the Crimea as well hold regular reenactments, many pictures of which have been used in these videos. Key to the remembrance of Inkerman are the memorials. On the battlefield itself, there exist some, with one, deep in the scrub, commemorating the action at the Sandbag Battery, curiously emblazoned with an ode to what possibly is the Scots Fusilier Guards. To the war in general, there exist memorials at the Elma to both sides, and an obelisk stands in Istanbul, Turkey, near where the British base at Scutari was. Curiously, a large monument to the war can be found in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Of course, the most well-known memorial to the Crimean War is in London, where it stands at Waterloo Place. Ostensibly to the Guards, and featuring representations of soldiers from the three regiments present, it holds place as the de facto Crimean Memorial, though many, many more exist throughout the UK. For a more in-depth discussion of this memorial, may I suggest a video done by friend of the channel Darrell, who breaks down its history in his usual distinctive style. Perhaps the most personal commemoration of the battle lay with the issue of the Crimean War Medal. Approved in December of 1854 and known for its ornate clasps denoting participation in any of 4 battles, each man, present at Inkerman, would have received it, and serves as a fine example of a mid-Victorian campaign award. I must extend many thanks to Patrick Mercer, who has helped greatly my understanding of the battle and its details. His kind offer of assistance when the project began has proven to be a most welcome source of information and clarification. And to Harry, a serving soldier in the Grenadier Guards, he supplied the Grenadier's plume and valise plate for mounting on the ammunition pouch. His energy and interest in the project have served as a touchstone with the modern regiment. None of the maps or 3D renders of the battlefield would have been possible without the kind permission of Hugh Small to use his wonderful graphics. These, and the modern-day pictures provided by Patrick Mercer, added so much to the presentation. The many references used for this project have been mentioned before, and include the works of Kinglake, Mercer, Small, and Barthorpe. If you're in need of exceptionally high quality and historic ammunition for your P-53 Enfield,
then stop by Brett's website, papercartridges.com.
If you'd like to view British Muzzleloaders and many other channels in an ad-free environment, free from the content restraints of YouTube and other platforms, then I might suggest you head on over to History of Weapons and War, where you can subscribe and find this channel and many like it, presented as they should be, all in one place. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British Muzzleloaders there as well.